Hey Union, it's me, Reverend Jeri, Katherine, and I thought I would do a special lesson today because this is one of my favorite Sundays of the year. Yep, you guessed it, it has something to do with John Wesley. It is May 24th, which we call Aldersgate Sunday, remembering that day on May 24th, 1738, that John Wesley had his heart strangely warmed. So I decided I would put a lesson out there on what I call Aldersgate Wesley. This is one of 5 lessons I taught to the Seekers class this past spring, and this is number 3 of 5 lessons in the years 1735 to 1740 of John Wesley's life. And we begin with John Wesley sailing to the colonies. He went to the colonies to Georgia in 1735, and I told in the previous lesson before this one, actually in both of them before this one, about John Wesley being a really, really eager learner. He loved to just consume all kinds of knowledge, not just to consume it, but to share it to benefit himself and benefit others. And so in a very amazing way, John Wesley, as he prepared for this trip to Georgia, he learned about all the native plants and herbs that could be used for food and medicine, but he also knew that Georgia was a hodgepodge of refugees and people seeking asylum and refuge and protection for religious beliefs. So there were lots of languages spoken because people were from all different places. So in preparing for the colonies, he learned how to speak Italian, Spanish, and French. He already knew Koine Greek, the Greek the Bible's written in, Hebrew, and Latin. So very learned man. So my lesson begins in 1735, October 14th, with John Wesley, his brother Charles, and 2 of the other Holy Club members from Oxford aboard the Simmons, setting sail for Georgia, the colony started by Oglethorpe. So here we go. Let's jump into this lesson. So Oglethorpe, General James Oglethorpe, founded the colony of Georgia in 1733, and in 1735, Oglethorpe invited John Wesley to be the colony's chaplain. And so John would not travel without his brother Charles, so Oglethorpe appointed Charles Wesley, the writer of all those many thousands of hymns, to be Oglethorpe's private secretary. Officially, his title was Secretary for Indian Affairs, and so Charles and John and 2 of their friends from the Holy Club, Benjamin Ingham and Charles Del Monte, set sail on the Simmons together on October 14th, 1735, 4-month journey to Savannah. And as I said before, aboard this ship and already in the colony, there were lots of different kinds of people. Georgia was known as a haven for persecuted religious sects and also debtors. So you kind of had the religious people and the debtors, the criminals. And you also, so you had the Salzburgers, who were the German-speaking Protestant refugees from the Catholic area of Salzburg, Austria, who found home in Georgia. You also had Scotch Highlanders, who were specifically recruited by Oglethorpe because they were known as the best fighters, the best soldiers in the world. And so Oglethorpe intentionally invited them because he wanted to have some protection, a buffer between the English in Georgia and the Spanish in Florida. So there was also a little Spanish influence there too. There was other people from Italy also who were given refuge in Georgia. Also aboard the ship and also present in Georgia, the colony, were the Moravians. And the Moravians aboard the Simmons on his journey from England to the New World really had a great impact upon John Wesley. Especially after a couple months, just a few months into their journey, there was a huge storm that broke the main mast. And while everyone, including John Wesley, Charles Wesley, and their two friends were panicking and very, very scared, the Moravians on board the ship were very, very peaceful. And they were calm in the middle of the storm. In fact, in the middle of the storm, instead of panicking and worrying, they were praying and they were singing hymns. And so John Wesley had a form of holy envy, if you will. You know, that book out by Barbara Brown Taylor, highly recommend it. Recommend it, Holy Envy. John Wesley had a holy envy of his own, of these fearless Moravians, for their fearless faith. And so instead of just letting himself be envious of their fearless, steadfast faith, John Wesley befriended the Moravians to learn from them, wanting to deepen his own faith and to grow closer to God. And so he left that 4-month journey with a whole new profound respect and friendship for the Moravians, which had a huge impact on the rest of his ministry. And then on February 6, 1736, John Wesley and the people aboard the Simmons landed on Peeper Island, which is now known as Cockspur Island. And John Wesley was invited by the whole ship to lead a prayer of thanksgiving, which he did. And then they went on their way to Savannah, where on March 7th, so just about a month after they landed, John Wesley preached his first sermon in Savannah. Charles Wesley was asked by Oglethorpe to not only be his private secretary, but to be chaplain at Fort Frederica on St. Simon Islands, just 75 miles south of Savannah, which today is no drive at all, but imagine they didn't have highways and byways with automobiles on them, so it's quite the journey away from between John Wesley and Charles Wesley. But that's where Oglethorpe's main headquarters were located, on St. Simon Island. But it turns out after a couple of months, Charles Wesley really didn't get along with Oglethorpe or many of the other colonists, and he was really, really sick a lot, so he became disheartened, and after only 6 months of being in Georgia, Charles Wesley returned to England, leaving from England from our very own Charleston in August of 1736, leaving John Wesley alone here in the colonies. So John Wesley was not immune from his own problems in Savannah, much like those of Charles Wesley's in Fort Frederica in Savannah. On St. Simon's Island. John Wesley was appointed the chaplain of the colony, but also a missionary. And he had a lot of problems, which in my lesson on the Oxford Wesley, he dealt with those kind of same problems, which included people accusing him of being too rigorous, not very friendly, not relationship building, very judgmental and harsh and hard, and had too many high expectations and standards. And John Wesley kind of came from that Oxford setting as an Oxford missionary, very much a high church minister, preaching to really more of the humbler classes of Englishmen and Scottish people and Highlanders and Portuguese Jews and Salzburg refugees. So, this diversity was very much like London, plus the geography of his parish were way too much for one man. So the diversity was hard. Which was true in London too, but very much more so in the New World. And the geography of the parish of Georgia was just huge. The parish he served in Savannah was over 200 miles in length, and the depth was immeasurable. And so that was a lot of ground to cover. John Wesley, began to learn German, French, and Italian. Did I say German? I meant to say German. And he also began to learn Spanish too. He had to minister in German, and French, and Italian, and Spanish, and he had to teach himself that and also lead worship in those languages. So he set up a daily schedule for the different colonists to attend worship. So from 5 a.m. to 6:30 a.m., he led English prayers. From 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., he led Italian prayers, and this is a daily schedule. From 10:30 a.m. to 12:30, he led a communion service in English, and from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, he led French prayers. And then this is sweet. I love this. From 2 p.m. to 3 p.m., John Wesley himself led the catechism for all the children in the colonies. So whoever could get there, I guess, did. And then from 3 to 4, again, he led English prayers. And so I guess the in-between time was his own studies. He also, of course, tried to reach out to the Native Americans, which we'll get to in a minute. But throughout this whole daily schedule, his time there, John Wesley continued to be in contact with the Moravians as a student of their way, not a teacher. He also needed self-care. He also needed somebody to teach and preach to him, so he went to the Moravians. So not as a teacher, but in his learning and being with the Moravians, he began to question the state of his soul. And if you know the history of John Wesley from a young boy, from young John Wesley to Oxford Wesley to now Aldersgate Wesley, John Wesley was always kind of looking for a sign of that he was saved, that God had the outward sign matched the inner sign, the inner workings of his heart. And so in learning with the Moravians, he began to feel like to question the salvation of his soul. And his relationship with the Moravians grew at the settlement of Ebenezer, and during his time of difficulty with the other main colonists, and that very rigorous daily schedule, he really found solace with the Moravians at the settlement of Ebenezer, not only learning, but a time and place of peace for him. Again, self-care during these difficult days as a missionary and chaplain to the Georgia colony. And then, so everybody knows about John Wesley, his time in the Americas being a failure. So I want to get to the root of what I think are, well, kind of his personality. He had a lot of rough edges that needed to be softened out, don't we all? But two of his main downfalls in the colonies had to do with two people. So Thomas Coston, who was chosen by Oglethorpe to be the first magistrate of Savannah, judge, and he was also the storekeeper for the colonies, for the colony of Georgia, where supplies were bought on credit or work. So you could agree to help build something, and those hours were translated to goods. And he was the storekeeper of keeping it up with the hours of work and what that equaled in goods. So this man, Thomas Coston, the magistrate and the storekeeper, also was a problem for John Wesley, but also really for Oglethorpe, because he jeopardized his authority as governor anytime he was gone. Thomas Coston was not very educated, but he was given a lot of responsibility, and he had somewhat of a trouble brewing nature that tended to cause a lot of strife and conflict with the authority figures, but he was kind of well known and well liked ish among the humbler colonists. While Oglethorpe had returned to England for a little bit, for example, this is a kind of authority troublemaking person he was. He court-martialed Oglethorpe while Oglethorpe had returned to England for a bit, leaving John Wesley behind. So John Wesley was the chaplain to the colonies, but when Charles Wesley left, John Wesley kind of assumed the role as Oglethorpe's private secretary. So anytime Oglethorpe left, John Wesley was kind of the eyes and ears for Oglethorpe in the colonies. And so this time that Oglethorpe was court-martialed by Thomas Costin, John Wesley reported him all the misdoings that Thomas did while he was gone, because John Wesley was remaining loyal to Oglethorpe. Well, of course, this did not make Thomas Costin mad because he felt like John Wesley betrayed him, but really Costin was a very dishonest businessman and he dealt corruptly with a lot of people, but for John Wesley, it made him really mad that Thomas dealt really dishonestly with the Moravians. And so Thomas, because of his dishonest dealings with the Moravians, really did not have a friend in John Wesley. The Moravians did a lot of hard work in exchange for their supplies at the store, and Thomas Costin did not pay the Moravians for their work and would refuse them supplies. So John Wesley caught wind of Thomas Costin's dishonesty and reported the wrong to Oglethorpe, and so Thomas Costin was removed from the office of chief magistrate. He wasn't the judge because he was misusing the colony's money for personal gain as the storekeeper. So two roles that probably shouldn't have been together anyways. So this made Thomas Costin really mad because he really lost everything. He lost his role as chief magistrate and storekeeper, and so Thomas Costin wanted revenge on John Wesley. I'm going to leave that there for just a minute and tell you the other person who had significant impact on John Wesley's downfall, Sophia Hopkey. So Sophia Hopkey met John Wesley on the 4-month trip from England to the colonies. During that time, John Wesley was employed by Sophia's mother to teach her French, even though John Wesley was really just learning some of that. But affection between both of them arose during that journey that they worked together as student and teacher. So Sophia, all the while on that trip, and then even in the first couple months in the colonies, believed that John Wesley's intentions were to lead to matrimony, and that was John Wesley's intent. So, but of course, he had to seek advice from someone, so he sought advice from his friends in the Moravian community, specifically a bishop, Bishop Spangenberg, I believe, from a bishop in the Moravian community, and the bishop in the Moravian community told John Wesley to avoid contact with female admirers at all times. And so John Wesley, being a very young John Wesley, well, really, he's 33 at this time, John Wesley took advice from this bishop without any explanation to Sophia. He just abruptly stopped seeing Sophia, and guess what? Sophia was Thomas Costin's niece, and John Wesley already had beef with Thomas Costin, and so here's where Thomas could get revenge. So on March 12, 1737, Sophia Hopkey married William Williamson, a clerk in Thomas Costin's store. Sophia Hopkey and William Williamson ran away to South Carolina to marry in Spurriesburg on March 12, 1737. Sophia Hopkey's quick shotgun marriage tore John Wesley up to the point of being totally inconsolable. His heart was broken. He continued to vow his utmost love for Sophia Hopkey, but he made kind of some bad decisions as a pastor and a person. On August 7, 1737, John Wesley refused to give Sophia Hopkey and her new husband, William Williamson, Holy Communion. So a complaint was issued by the Williamsons against John Wesley for defaming Sophia in front of the whole congregation without due cause. The Williamsons sued John Wesley for 1,000 pounds of sterling silver for the damages of defamation of Sophia Hopkey's character. And so John Wesley had to go to court, which he wasn't obliged, because he said it was an ecclesiastical matter, not a civil matter, a church matter, not a civil government matter. But meanwhile, Thomas Costin was working in the background as uncle to Sophia Hopkey and nemesis to John Wesley. He spread the rumor that John Wesley sought revenge against Sophia Hopkey for not accepting his marriage proposal. Sophia Hopkey signed an affidavit that John Wesley had proposed many times, to which she had always declined. Thomas Costin challenged John Wesley to a sword duel. Impatient to wait on the courts, he was a man who had a very fiery nature and wanted to settle things outside the courts. John Wesley, of course, refused to fight Thomas, but instead he wrote a letter to Sophia Hopkey explaining his action. His rationale was that, 1, partakers of Holy Communion must signify their names to the curate at least a day before communion, and they had not. 2, you can't take communion when there is wrong between you and someone else. There was wrong between Hopkey and Wesley. 3, she hadn't been to church since she got married in March, and it was now August. So shame on her for not going to church. Well, Thomas, again, working in the background because he wanted revenge on John Wesley, secured a jury so that John Wesley went to trial on August 22nd, 1737. The trial ended in mistrial. John Wesley went to trial many times, though, after this, in September and then on November 3rd in 1737. It was clear that due to growing opposition throughout the colony against John Wesley would be forced to leave the colony and return to England. So, on November 24th, 1737, John Wesley publicly announced his intention to return to England, but in the meantime, he continued to preach on the subjects such as regulating one's passions and mutual forgiveness to his congregation in the colonies. Then on December 22nd, 1737, John Wesley left Georgia a very defeated man, discouraged and uncertain about his future, feeling like an utter failure. But before we get on the boat to go back to England with John Wesley, let's talk about John Wesley and the Native Americans. So, one of the most exciting things that John Wesley anticipated about his time in the New World, in the colonies in Georgia, would be being a missionary to the Native Americans. He said before leaving on October 14th, 1735, he said, "I will hear the gospel afresh by preaching it to the innocent savages, because they have no defense against the text." John Wesley wanted so much to go to the Native American villages, but Oglethorpe said absolutely not, for fear he would be scalped and killed. But John Wesley did make friends with Chief Tomochichi and a translator, Mary Musgrove, who helped John Wesley and the chief speak to one another. But all the pictures you see of John Wesley speaking, preaching to Native Americans are false. It never happened. John Wesley did not visit any of the Native American communities and never did preach to them as a whole. He only befriended one Native American, and Mary Musgrove, who translated for him. So This picture you see in this slide, not a real one, just an imaginary one. John Wesley had high hopes to preach and teach and get to know the Native Americans, but Oglethorpe refused that opportunity, probably for good reason at the time. So John Wesley left defeated and disheartened and feeling like a failure, but I think in hindsight's 2020, and we can glean some of the successes of the trip to the colony. Some have called John Wesley's time in Georgia a preface to victory. First, he firmly established a strict and personal rule of life that he started at the Oxford Club through and with the Holy at Oxford with the Holy Club. He continued that daily rule on his own, and that was a success that he actually followed until the day he died. He taught himself to speak German, Spanish, Italian, and French. And not only taught himself, but used those languages to minister, to preach, to teach, to build relationships with a diverse group of congregants. He wrote a lot of sermons during this time, and we have a lot of those sermons. He also composed the first hymn book ever to be used in an English church during those years. It's also where we believe as Methodists that the Methodist organizing of small groups began in Georgia, because remember, Georgia was such a vast geography territory for John Wesley to cover. He had to set people up or groups up in small communities that he could get around to, but when he wasn't there, they could continue to minister to one another. So small group organization began during this time, and also the idea probably of itinerant ministry, needing ministers who could be able to travel, because John Wesley was an itinerant minister in Georgia. But also one of the major successes was John Wesley's contact with the Moravians, who had a deep impact in the colonies and would continue to do so in England. So let's go to John Wesley in England, and let's continue with the Moravians. Upon returning to England, John Wesley, of course, looked for a Moravian society to be a part of, and he met and befriended Peter Böhler. They had lots of conversations, great kindred friends and thinkers and theologians, lots of conversations on doctrine, theology, contemporary issues, as well as confession of John Wesley's personal crisis. He told Peter Böhler, how can you preach to others who have not faith yourself? He was talking about himself. How do I preach when I don't even have faith, when I'm feeling like a failure, when I don't even know about my relationship with God and the salvation of my own soul? So he asked Böhler whether he thought he should leave off preaching or not. And Böhler answered very wisely, John Wesley, by no means. But then he asked, what can I preach? And Böhler said to him, preach faith till you have it, and then because you have it, you will preach faith. Wise words. Wesley was convinced by the happiness and the holiness of the Moravians, as this happiness and holiness were the fruits of a living and active faith. John Böhler and John Wesley together in their search to grow deeper in God established the United Society on Fetter Lane on May 1st, 1738. And then on May 24th, 1738, John Wesley, still feeling very much like a failure and questioning his faith, he reluctantly went to another Bible study because because Peter Böhler told him, don't only preach faith until you have it, but also pursue to go deeper in your faith even when you're questioning it. So he continued to go to Bible study, and this night on May 24th, he went to a Bible study on Aldersgate Street in London, and listening to the preface of Romans by Martin Luther, he wrote that he had his heart strangely warm, that he felt like God did love him, even him. And so we call that John Wesley's Aldersgate moment, the moment he had his heart strangely warmed. And from that moment, he was kind of set on fire. In August 1738, John Wesley went to visit the hub of Moravians, Herrnhut in Saxony, Germany, where the home of Count Zinzendorf, who started the Moravian Church. And he was super impressed during this visit in August 1738 by their organization and their spiritual discipline. And he called them the closest manifestation to primitive Christianity that he had ever witnessed. And of course, he wanted that for himself, and he wanted that for his church, which he was still part of the Church of England right now. But on the other hand, Wesley's trip to Herrnhut was a confrontation between his idealized image of the Moravians and the reality of Zinzendorf's authoritarian leadership style, which he did not like. Fetter Lane style. So then he left Herrnhut and went back to Fetter Lane Society, and that began to grow. But then his friend Peter Bowler, he went to the New World, and John Wesley took a lot of preaching trips. He was in high demand to preach in different places, so he frequently left Fetter Lane Society to another Moravian pastor who was sent from Herrnhut and who promoted stillness and also withheld the means of grace from those who did not have an instantaneous conversion experience. Wesley was against all of this, and for 9 months he tried to have conversations with this new Moravian pastor, until finally in July 1740, John Wesley stood up and he said, "I believe these assertions to be flatly contrary to the word of God. I have warned you hereof again and again and again, and besought you to turn back to the law and the testimony. I have borne with you long, hoping that you would return. But as I find you more and more confirmed in error of your ways, nothing now remains but that I shall give you up to God. You are of the same judgment. Follow me." I then, without saying anything more, withdrew, as did 18 or 19 of the society. And John Wesley left in those moments in July 1740 to start the Foundry, which is pictured here, the first Methodist gathering place. So this is the Aldersgate Wesley, 1735 to 1740. I think we can learn a lot from this era of John Wesley's life. There was a lot of challenges, questions, doubt, but he continued to pursue God through it all, and God continued to pursue him through it all. And he befriended some great people who spoke words of wisdom to him, encouraging him to not simply let go when you doubt, when you're challenged, when you're unsure, but to keep pursuing faith, and God will meet you, and God will make God's self known to you. And because of that, John Wesley had this wonderful, heartwarming moment where he felt like God dwelt within him and through him and wanted to use him. And now here we are, 80 denominations who attribute their foundings to John and Charles Wesley, which comprise 80 million people around the world, all from this guy who traveled to the colonies and felt like a failure and made some horrible mistakes, and then traveled back feeling very defeated and disheartened, and continued to learn, to grow, to pray, to sing, to praise, to worship, to study. and he had his heart strangely warmed, and we're here today because of it. So I hope that will give you some encouragement and hope, but also teach you a little bit about our founder, John Wesley. Again, this is just one of 5 lessons. It comes kind of in between of all the lessons. This is the 3rd of 5 lessons, so maybe I'll get to teaching you about the young John Wesley, the Oxford Wesley, the Aldersgate Wesley, and the older John Wesleys I break down into 2 lessons as well. So hope you've enjoyed this. Enjoy this Aldersgate Day, all you Methodists.